Okay, there is some backstory needed for the tale I'm about to tell. I started working here in the early days of my senior year at high school. At first, and by that I mean 2 days, nothing weird had happened. Then, he showed up. I call it a he only because that's what his general physique looked closest to. I've never actually been able to get close enough to see. It was my first overnight shift. I was working the front desk, and the night was particularly slow. No people looking for a place to stay, no one out for a stroll, not even a single car had passed. But then, he appeared. And when I say appeared, it's as if he just phased into existence. I was busy reading a book, holding it right in front of my face, so if anyone was approaching, I would be able to put it down and give the potential customer my full attention. This was back when I cared if I was doing good at my job. I was just turning a page when a figure appeared just above where I was looking. I looked up immediately from my book and stared out across the street at the person standing there. He wore khaki shorts and a green or gray t-shirt. It's hard to tell since he always shows up at night. It looked like he was wearing some kind of backpack. He would have appeared to be any ordinary elementary or even junior high school student if it weren't for the smiley face emoji mask that he always wore. And because of said mask, we will refer to him as Smiley from here on out. I put my book down and gave him an awkward little wave, unsure of what else to do. Even though this was my first experience at the motel, I wasn't a stranger to paranormal activity, but at the same time, I had just assumed this was a local kid trying to mess with me. So after a moment of thought, I had just decided to stay in the safety of my little glass box and watch him from a distance. Then I found myself sticking the key into the padlock, but being stopped before I had a chance to turn it. My coworker Matthew had put a hand on my shoulder and gave me a little rattle. "Hey man, I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, snapping me out of whatever kind of trance I was in. I blinked several times and looked around before I realized where I was. How did I get over here? It felt like a small chunk of my memory was being blocked or something. Matthew read the confused look on my face and said, "That thing? Never go to it. If it gestures for you to come over, do whatever you need to resist. It's almost got me a few times. But I find that pain is a pretty good resistant." That was only a week before Matthew went missing. His body was never found. It took about a week, but whatever was blocking my mind moved away and a few moments of forgotten time came back to me. While Smiley and I were staring at each other, he slowly raised his hand and waved me over. My mind felt instant euphoria. It was the happiest I had ever felt, as my mouth moved into an unusual shape around these parts. A smile. Something compelled me to get out of my seat and run over to the mask-wearing weirdo. Somehow, in that moment, I knew if I just went with him, I would become even happier, if that was possible. I had sprung to my feet and lunged at the door, key in hand and in a frenzy to not let this chance escape. Luckily though, in my mad attempt to open the door, I ended up fumbling with the padlock long enough that Matthew could snap me out of the trance. It sure is a shame no one ever found him. He was a good guy. This all came back to me while I was pouring milk into my cereal, which ended up all over my kitchen floor after the memory jump-scared me. Ever since then, Smiley comes back to the motel every couple of weeks, seemingly at random intervals, and always in almost the exact same spot. I started measuring just to make sure. He usually got spot on, but sometimes he was off by about a foot or less, depending on the day. And every time he showed up, we went through the same motions of him filling me with joy and trying to get me to come out of the motel. I, however, had taken Matthew's warning very seriously, and took to wearing about 5 black hairbands on my arm whenever I worked front desk. So as soon as he started gesturing, I could just snap them all. Even with all my preparedness, he almost got me a couple of times. He'd already have his hand up and waiting for as soon as I looked away from my book, and gesture as soon as I saw him. Too bad for Smiley, I'm incredibly clumsy, especially when duped up on happiness. So I tend to fall and knock myself out of the trance a lot. This time was different. He moved from his usual spot across the road to smack dab in the center. Not only that, but he never attempted to get me to leave, which sucks because I snapped myself as soon as I saw him out of habit. He just stood there, staring. So I stared back. I don't know how long we looked at each other through that glass panel that had a fingerprint just above eye level that I'm only now just noticing. It could have been a few minutes, maybe an hour. I don't know. I was way too curious to look away. Curious about his sudden shift in behavior. curious about where he went after his attempts to trance me failed. I'd never actually been able to see him leave. Or so much as move, really. Something usually happened to distract me. But not tonight. I kept my gaze entirely on him, even when one of the residents came up behind me and just sat there, chewing a candy bar, obnoxiously loud. I eventually said something to the person when I got tired of the sound of poor table manners. "Can I help you?" "The hell you staring at?" "The kid in the middle of the street." I gestured out towards him. The woman walked up right next to me, because apparently the owners didn't think we needed any type of separation from the people inside of our own gates. For some reason. Even with this unknown person right next to me, with her incessant chewing, I never let my gaze wander from Smiley, especially since I knew that this was one of the people who only owned shirts. That was the only option unless Plant Guy's voice dropped an octave or two. Nope. Still not seeing nothing. It took me a moment to understand what she had meant as opposed to what she had said. But then my mind latched onto the other odd part of her sentence. Why couldn't she see him? No one else has ever had problems with that. As far as I was aware, Smiley had taken at least 9 people, and they could all see him. But then the lady continued, completely ruining my train of thought. "You sure that head of yours is screwed on straight?" Then she grabbed the top of my head with her chocolate-covered fingers and pretended to turn my head, making a little squeaking sound, like she were turning a screw. She pulled away and started laughing. "Oh, this is fun! You're my buddy now!" She jumped up onto the desk and I prayed for the person who was going to replace me in a few hours. I'll just leave a note that says, "Can you wash the desk, please?" That should do. I held in my gags and asked, What are you doing?" "I'm spending the night with my new buddy while he slowly loses his mind." She said that a little too cheerfully. I was about to politely ask her not to do that and please remove her bare skin from the desk, which put her right into my peripherals. That's when something completely unexpected happened. Smiley started to move. His masked face tilted up, looking above my head. Then he slowly raised his arm and waited for someone to come to him. I heard it before I realized what was happening. Thundering metallic clangs rang out and someone bolted down the stairs. And I'm not gonna lie, I genuinely had to struggle with myself to keep watching or stop what was about to happen. The lady, I'm just gonna call her Flan, turned to the source of the sound. "Paul, the hell you doing?" I groaned, turned and sized up the guy. He was possibly 6'7", give or take, and built like a linebacker. Paul was another Flan's pantsless clan. He crashed into the gate and it squealed under the pressure. He shook the chain link fence a couple times before turning his attention to the padlock. Now, I had the completely irrational thought that he was just going to try and rip it off, but instead he just turned to me and calmly asked, in a deep, soothing voice, "May I have the keys, please? It would be most pleasurable to leave this property." "I'd rather not do that." I started walking towards him. As I learned over the many encounters with Smiley, the easiest way to snap someone out of his trance was through touch. So even though I really didn't want to touch him, I knew what I had to do. So I reached out a hand, careful to keep my eyes above his waist. Now, I meant to pat him on the shoulder, but that's when he actually tried ripping the padlock. I panicked, because one of the many rules of Smiley is that it is imperative that you don't pass through the gate while he's around. So in my panic, I tripped and grabbed something else that we'll never talk about again. Let's just say I screamed, and he screamed, and Flan laughed. Then I quickly whipped my eyes away from that and looked back to the street. Smiley had taken that moment of aroused panic to slip away. And that's really all that happened last night. My shift ended, I left a note for Z, my replacement, and went home. With that said, I'll talk to you all again soon. Oh, P.S. I forgot to mention why we shouldn't leave the gate when Smiley is around. Well, one day long after Matthew's disappearance, I found a note in the laundry room. This note read, "Under no circumstances should you leave the property when it's here, no matter how happy he makes you feel, or even if you aren't enraptured by it. What it does to you is far worse than death." At the bottom of the picture was a penned doodle of a smiley face.